it often starts in a very ordinary moment. Maybe you're sitting at the kitchen table in the evening, scrolling through the news on your phone. Another headline about tensions rising between Israel and Iran. Analysts using phrases like escalation, retaliation, global risk. You pause for a second, not because you fully understand the geopolitics, most of us don't, but because a quieter question appears in the background of your mind. What happens to everything we've been building if the world becomes unstable? Your savings account, your investments, your retirement plan, the things that were supposed to grow slowly and predictably over time. For a long time, many of us have lived with the assumption that the financial system is mostly stable. Markets go up and down, of course. There are recessions. There are shocks. But underneath it all, there's a sense that the structure holds. That tomorrow will look broadly similar to today. But moments like this introduce a different feeling. You start to notice how much of modern finance quietly depends on global stability. Supply chains crossing oceans, energy flowing through fragile regions, markets reacting instantly to events thousands of miles away. And suddenly, the idea of a major conflict doesn't just sound like a political story. It feels personal, not in a dramatic, end-of-the-world kind of way. More like a subtle shift in the background. Assumptions we've been relying on for decades. Because when people hear phrases like global, conflict, or even World War III, the first instinct is usually fear. Images of chaos, collapse, panic. But the financial reality is often more complicated than that. Some assets weaken, others become surprisingly resilient. Certain systems bend but don't break. And the people who stay calm enough to understand these patterns tend to navigate uncertainty very differently from those who react purely out of fear. The uncomfortable truth is that most people only start thinking about these things after instability has already begun, not before, which raises a quieter, more useful question. If the world really does move into a period of deeper geopolitical tension, what actually happens to your money? Most people imagine global conflict like a sudden storm, something dramatic, loud, immediate, a single event that flips the entire system, overnight. But financially, large conflicts tend to behave less like a lightning strike and more like pressure, slowly building inside a structure. At first, nothing collapses. The walls still stand. The lights are still on. Markets continue opening every morning. From the outside, the system looks surprisingly normal. But underneath, certain forces begin shifting. Think of the global economy, like a large network of pipes, carrying water between countries. Energy flows from one region, manufacturing flows from another, capital flows through financial markets. In stable times, the water moves smoothly. But when geopolitical tension rises, those pipes don't necessarily break. They narrow. They reroute. Sometimes they get blocked for a while, and when that happens, pressure starts building in unexpected places. Oil prices react first. Shipping routes change. Insurance costs for cargo increase. Governments begin spending more on defense. Supply chains that once felt invisible suddenly become fragile. None of this feels dramatic in isolation. But collectively, it starts to change the environment where money grows. This is where many people misunderstand what war does to wealth. They imagine banks closing, currencies disappearing, markets shutting down completely. Those things can happen in extreme cases, but for most developed economies, the more common effect is distortion rather than collapse. Prices shift. Certain industries become more important. Others quietly struggle. Inflation begins to behave differently because governments are spending heavily and resources are being redirected. It's less like the financial world stops working, and more like the rules of the game begin to tilt. Psychologically, this creates a strange reaction in people. When uncertainty rises, the human brain looks for something solid to hold on to. Some people rush toward cash, others toward gold, others sell everything and wait on the sidelines. But these reactions often come from fear rather than understanding. Because the real story during periods of geopolitical tension isn't just about danger. It's about how money moves when stability becomes less certain. And once you start looking at global events through that lens, the headlines begin to feel slightly different. Not just alarming, informative. I remember the first time I felt this shift personally. Not during a major crisis. Not during a market crash. It was a quiet evening sitting at my desk, scrolling through the news after a long day. There were headlines about rising tensions in the Middle East, military movements, diplomatic warnings, analysts debating what might happen next. At first it felt distant. Those kinds of stories appear often, and most of the time life continues exactly the same the next morning. Markets open, people go to work, the world keeps moving. But that night I caught myself doing something different. Instead of just reading the headlines, I opened my investment account. Nothing had really changed yet. My portfolio looked normal. The numbers were steady. But I noticed a subtle thought forming in the background. Not panic, just a quiet question. What actually happens to all of this if the world becomes less stable? For a long time, I had thought about money in very personal terms. Income, savings rate, investment returns. The usual things we're told to focus on when building wealth. But geopolitical risk sits outside that framework. You can do everything right financially and still live inside a system that's reacting to forces far beyond your control. That realization didn't make me feel helpless. It made me curious. I started noticing how markets would react to even small geopolitical signals. Oil prices moving slightly after a headline. Defense stocks quietly climbing. Currency markets shifting in ways that most people never talk about. And what struck me most was how calm it all looked from the outside. There were no dramatic alarms, no clear moment where someone announces that the rules are changing. Instead, it felt more like the financial landscape slowly adjusting its shape, almost like watching the tide move in or out. Gradual but powerful. That was the moment I started thinking about wealth differently during global uncertainty. Not as something fragile, but as something that needs to be positioned carefully within a changing environment. That shift in perspective didn't lead to dramatic changes. There wasn't a moment where I suddenly sold everything or moved my money into something extreme. If anything, the adjustment was quieter than that. It started with paying attention to how stability actually feels. In calm economic periods, it's easy to mistake growth for security. When markets rise for years, portfolios expand, and income steadily increases. The entire system feels reliable, almost permanent. But global tensions have a way of reminding you that financial systems are still built on human decisions, political relationships, and fragile agreements between countries. Once you see that clearly, your relationship with money becomes slightly different. You begin to value flexibility more than prediction. Because the truth is, no one can consistently predict how a conflict between major powers will unfold. Analysts can model scenarios, economists can project outcomes, and news cycles will always try to frame the next headline as decisive. But the real world tends to move in ways that are slower, more complex, and far less certain. So the focus naturally shifts. Instead of asking, what exact event will happen next? The more useful question becomes something quieter. How exposed is my life to sudden shocks? That question doesn't produce dramatic answers. It simply brings attention to structure. You start noticing the difference between wealth that depends on constant stability and wealth that can survive periods of uncertainty. The distinction isn't always visible from the outside. Two people can appear equally successful. Similar homes, similar lifestyles, similar investment portfolios on paper. But internally, their financial lives may be built on very different foundations. One structure requires everything to keep working smoothly. The other has space for disruption. Over time, that difference becomes more meaningful than the size of the numbers themselves. Because global uncertainty doesn't usually destroy wealth overnight. More often, it exposes which financial structures were quietly fragile all along. And once you recognize that pattern, something subtle begins to change in how you think about resilience. And maybe that's the deeper realization that slowly settles in. Moments of geopolitical tension, like the recent escalation between Israel and Iran, remind us that the global system we depend on is more fragile than it often appears. Military strikes, retaliations, and widening regional conflict have already begun affecting energy routes, supply chains, and financial markets in subtle ways. But for most people, the real impact doesn't arrive as a dramatic collapse. It arrives quietly, a little more volatility in the market. Energy prices creeping higher, currencies shifting slightly, inflation lingering longer than expected. The world rarely changes all at once. Instead, it adjusts. And during periods like this, something interesting happens in how people think about money. Many instinctively search for the perfect move, the perfect asset, the perfect prediction, the perfect hedge against uncertainty. But over time, it becomes clear that financial resilience rarely comes from perfect timing. It comes from structure. From building a life where temporary instability doesn't immediately threaten your peace of mind, where your investments have time to recover, where your expenses don't force urgent decisions, where uncertainty, even global uncertainty, becomes something you can observe, rather than something that controls you. Because the truth is, large geopolitical events have always existed. Wars, crises, political shifts. They appear again and again throughout history. Markets fall, recover, adapt, and continue moving forward. What often matters more than the event itself is the position you were already in when it happened. If your financial life is stretched thin, uncertainty feels terrifying. But if your foundation is steady, the same uncertainty simply becomes another phase of the cycle. And that realization can be strangely calming, because it means that even in a world where conflicts escalate, alliances shift, and headlines grow louder, the quiet work of building stability still matters. Not because it prevents uncertainty, but because it gives you the ability to live through it without constantly feeling like everything could fall apart.